Hey Craig,
Hey, Simon.
what do you have for me today?
Okay, well, I have a story that, it has to do with what does the decline of the neighborhood barbershop have to do with QAnon?
QAnon. Okay.
Is kind of where we start and where we end up. Um, so I'm going to probe a little bit of your background knowledge on this. And now I know that you already know a little bit of what I'm going to talk about because you brought up the book, but Bowling Alone. How much
Yeah.
of that do you remember? And what can you summarize for me?
Really very little. I know it was a book written some time ago, and the kind of thesis behind it is that there was at some point there was the height of the bowling league and how, most people who went bowling did so in some kind of league or some kind of group or something like that. And the percentage of bowling that's now happening with someone bowling completely alone has, gone up, and that's somehow
Mhm.
a stand-in or metaphor for or some kind of indicator of how much we as a society are becoming kind of disconnected and no longer have some kind of different civic groups to hang out with, whether it's like church groups
Mhm.
or hobbyist groups or something like that, and that I guess humans are becoming less connected to their communities or something like that.
Yeah, that's pretty much the gist of Bowling Alone. Um, and as well, what do you know about the Manson family?
So they were in California.
Mhm.
They were somehow, some of them were connected to Hollywood in some form or fashion. The Charles Manson was a cult leader who attracted lots of young hippie cultists, and at some point, um, decided to, they all went on a rampage and murdered several, I think either famous people or family members of famous people,
Mhm.
including like some famous director's wife or something like that.
Roman Polanski's wife. Yeah.
Roman Polanski's wife. And the only reason I sort of know as much as I know now is just because of that Quentin Tarantino movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood,
Right, right, yeah.
which is like an alternate history of what could have
Mhm.
happened with that.
How long do you know, or so, how long do you think the Manson family existed as a thing, I guess, prior to everything imploding after the murders and everyone being in prison?
As a cult, how long did it last?
Hmm.
No idea. I mean, I would guess considering that in the movie most of the members were pretty young, I would have guessed only a few years.
Okay. Yeah. Well, actually less than that, about 2 years.
Okay.
And so that's actually where I'm going to start here and then hopefully loop back around to QAnon. So we're going to dive into that in a minute. But first, what's the name of the podcast, Simon?
The name of the podcast is Momentary Experts, and you can find it wherever you get your podcast, whether that's Spotify, Apple, and there's also a video version on YouTube.
Yeah. So, this week on Momentary Experts, it's my turn to spend a few hours before the podcast falling down Wikipedia holes and becoming a momentary expert on a topic. And what got me thinking about this topic was actually your presentation last week about prohibition, specifically in terms of the decline in the number of neighborhood bars and saloons. So I went and looked it up, and it's actually kind of crazy. It's one of those things that, yeah, we're still seeing the effects. So, and I couldn't find the number right prior to Prohibition, but in 1897, there were 215,000 licensed saloons in the United States.
Okay, that sounds like a lot,
Uh,
especially with a much smaller population back then.
yeah, yeah, a population of about 110 million people, right? So less than a
Mhm.
third of what it is now. There were about 215,000 licensed official saloons, plus about 50,000 more unlicensed. Um, any any kind of guess as to the current number of bars in the United States with a population of 300 and like I think 40 million people right now or something like that, or about to hit it?
I'm gonna average a thousand bars per state, so I'm gonna say 50,000.
You're a little bit low, but 67,000.
Okay, so way
Yeah.
less than what than during prohibi or pr prior to prohibition.
Yeah, I mean less than a third
Yeah,
with three times the population from 215,000 licensed and about 50,000 unlicensed to 67,000 now, right?
yeah,
That's
yeah.
that is a substantial decrease.
Hmm.
Um so I got to thinking about what I had and like I've never read Bowling Alone, but one time I read an article about Bowling Alone, about this idea of sort of like the loss of local community and community engagement. And that ended up leading me to the Manson family, which is where I'll start. So the Manson family was one of these things that stuck in my brain. A while ago because I learned this fact about it that just kind of broke my brain and how I thought of it is that I don't know, I just in my head I assume that because, and maybe it's because it's one of those things, that like occupies such a huge part of our like cultural consciousness, right? I mean, it's the
Hmm.
Manson family, right? Everybody
Yeah,
knows what the Manson family is.
yeah.
And I
Even
just
though
assume,
even though I didn't know anything about them until I saw that movie,
yeah.
I knew of Charles Manson, and I knew that he was like some kind of cultist murderer.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, everybody knows that Charles Manson was a cult leader and that his followers murdered some people, right? Like that. And so I guess I just assumed that it was around for longer. So you came in at like a few years. It was actually two, right? And so I started thinking a lot, I remember about like hell, like how does somebody just turn people into murder hobos in 2 years, right? Like, and I started thinking about could I do that? Like I'm a fairly intelligent guy. I'm not too off-putting. I can tell a decent story. Give me 30 years, I couldn't convince a group of people to go murder for me. I don't believe that I could. I would not be able to. So, um, that was when I started digging into the Manson family more. And a really interesting thing about the Manson family story is how it starts. Charles Manson is released from prison, age 32, in March 21st, 1967. And he had at that point spent more than half his life in prison. He
Oh
was
wow.
probably illiterate. I mean, he could say his ABCs, but he was probably illiterate.
Hmm.
And he actually asked to stay at his parole hearing. He told them he didn't want to leave because he didn't know how to do anything. Like he couldn't read, he had no work experience, he had no job prospects, he had no family, he had no friends. He was terrified of leaving prison. He's like, if I go out there, I'm fucked. Like, what am I gonna do? I can't do anything. Let me stay in prison. I got a job in the laundry. I know which channel line to get into. I understand prison. Like I'm
Did,
doing well here. I like
did
prison,
he
right?
did he I mean he wasn't that old either. Did he just have like some messed up childhood where he was just
Oh
completely
yeah, yeah, going way back. I mean, yeah, his mother was like a prostitute, and he was arrested. I think he was put in prison by the time he was 11 or something like that. Was like his first stint. He would like uh witnessed his mom sleeping with men as a prostitute when he was a little child. I mean, really fucked up childhood, just bad, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, he was 32 when he was released in 67, but he over half his life he spent in prison. He didn't want to leave. He wasn't released from prison, he was kicked out of prison, right?
Mhm.
Like how bad are you at the world when you're like, this is the only place where I feel safe. This is the only place I know I can get a meal. Like I understand this. I don't. I tried being out there. I fuck up every time. Please let me stay. They're like, no, good luck. Go be a person, right? So he gets kicked out of prison. Literally
Yeah.
kicked out of prison. They like just shove him out the door and shut it behind him real quick. In March of 1967. By summer of 1967, he's moved first to like Berkeley, California, and then to the Hyde-Ashbury district of San Francisco, which is of course famous as like where all the hippies were. And then within a year, he is basically living with a harem of about 18 women in an apartment in Hyde Ashbury. Like the first person he hooks up with, this librarian named Susan Brunner. Um, and then he
Was he
can
good looking?
not really.
Oh,
No.
okay.
He's
Okay.
kind of just like a just a normal looking dude, right?
Yeah.
And he convinces her to have all these other women come stay there. And so by the summer of like 18 of 1968, he's basically got a harem. He establishes what they call the family officially at a ranch in Northern California called Spawn Ranch in August of 1968, which is really when the family is like official, right?
Mhm.
That's officially the Manson family is at a place, they're at a ranch, and from then it's just 1 year. It's just 1 year until they turn into murder hobos. And some of the people involved in like the Tate murders, Leslie Van Houten, for example, had only been in the family for like 10 months,
Yeah.
was like a normal person, right? And so I'm thinking, like, what the hell was the allure, right? Like,
Mhm.
what would like I had to go look it up. Like, what was the like what are the teachings of Charles Manson, right? What is so fucking persuasive about whatever this guy is saying? People and they're like, yes, absolutely, I'll go murder a 9 month pregnant wife of a movie director, right? And when you read about his teachings, let's just say there's a reason why nobody is studying the philosophy of Charles Manson. It's fucking ridiculous. It's what you would expect to come out of the mind of a barely literate, uneducated felon, right?
Mhm.
Just like this mishmash, the helter skelter, this idea of like a race war is coming and they're going to retreat underground, and then 144,000 people are going to survive, which is probably something that he heard from like a Jehovah's Witness at some point. And but it's just like it's nonsense, right? But that's because what he was teaching, like his teachings, his philosophy wasn't the attractive thing, and that's what we're going to get into later. Is actually what allowed him, what was so powerful that allowed this barely literate or functionally illiterate felon to, within a year of being released from prison, and was so scared that he begged to stay, turns into a cult leader, right? So we'll come back to that in a second. Um, but I want to get back to third places. So have you heard this term, third place?
Only from you. So from what you said at the end of last episode is that it's a place that isn't your work or isn't your home. So it's someplace else you go that isn't one of those two things.
Exactly, yeah. So specifically, it's any place that's not those two places that serves a community building function. Um, and we have seen an enormous decline in functional third spaces over the really kind of the post World War II era that were accelerated by the flight to the suburbs, right? So the term third place was kind of coined by this sociologist named Ray Oldenburg in the 80s. And he was writing about what he called unfunctional zoning. So he's looking at um, sort of places that people used to use as like community building places, which are now gone, right? So he focused on a couple of places. He focused on the familiar idea of like the neighborhood barbershop, you know, in
Mhm.
like the 1950s movie, it's full of people who are hanging out. None of them are there to get a haircut.
Yeah. It's
They're
just
just chatting and hanging out, right?
yeah. Mhm.
Um, and he also looked at neighborhood bars. Prior to the banishment of bars being moved to basically strip malls and commercial strips, right? So, like, prior to the rise of this idea of zoning as we're going to separate all the places where people live from all the places where people do business, right? Which was like the allure of the suburbs. The suburbs are quiet, they're peaceful. It's just houses and lawns, and there's nothing to do, right? So, but
Yeah.
now,
It's impossible to set up a bar in the middle of some random neighborhood.
yeah, yeah, in like the turning, twisting, endless meadowlark courts and Sparrowbrook lanes, right?
Yeah.
It's just houses. Prior to the almost now universal banishment of like bars to strip malls and commercial districts, the average neighborhood bar, and I'm reading this here, yeah, the average neighborhood bar drew about 80% of its business from a 2 block radius,
Makes sense.
which means that it like, and I looked it up in Omaha. It used to be in the like late 1900s. There was an average of, and this was pretty standard for most American cities. There was about a bar every 4 to 6 square blocks, right?
Yeah.
Every single neighborhood had a bar. That was the one that you went to. That's a third place. And there are these common attributes of third places. They are typically a neutral ground, so no political sort of like obligations really. Very few, if any, financial obligations, right? Some might have a small one, like, okay, you're going to buy a glass of beer at the bar, but then you can
Mhm.
just pretty much stay there for as long as you want to. They're typically what they call a level place where community is emphasized over social status, right? So there's not going to be in the neighborhood barbershop a seat reserved for the wealthier people or the poor people got to go sit in the back, right? It's
Yeah.
people come in as equals. And conversation are really the central activities, right? Just talking to people, hanging out with no pressure to do a thing, right? You
Yeah.
can just be there. And they're also typically very easily accessible. Like you have to be able to get to them, you can walk to them, right? They're not exclusionary, right? It's like a country club that you have to be a member of does not function as a third place. That's anti third place, right? That is exclusionary by its very nature, right? It has to be a place where anyone can come. So as we've moved, though, particularly like with white flight and the flight of people from urban areas to the calmness, the greenery of the suburbs, where it's calm and quiet and everything is rigidly zoned for either commercial or residential, then you end up in sort of these dead zones of community. And it's one of those things that that like once I started reading about it this afternoon more, I also started thinking about like my experiences with suburbs. So like particularly like my ex-wife and her family lived in one of those turny, twisty, suburban kind of like dead zones, right?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking that was kind of so odd to me. It was like when you go to those places, nobody's ever in their front yard.
Mhm.
Even someone's front yard is like you don't go there. Like people hang out on their back decks and their backyards and their fences, right? So like even like being in a front yard and publicly visible doing a thing is really not what people do. You're so enclosed off from your neighbors and from your community, and everyone just kind of stays home. Like you go to work, you come back, you go to work, you come back, you go to the store, you come back, right? But not really any of these third places.
And
And that was
everything's very car centric. Like
exactly, yeah. I mean,
so
often there's no sidewalks.
yeah, and like so much to the point where like whenever, I've lived in a city for now going on like 15 years, and it's a very walkable city. So like if something was is with even within 2 miles, and I'm not in a hurry, my
Mm,
wife and I are walking there. It's just an automatic thing. And it doesn't seem weird to us until we have someone who's from a more rural or suburban area come and stay with us, and we're like walking there, and they're like, wait, how far away is this?
yeah,
And I'm like, oh, it's 30-minute walk from here. And they're
yeah.
like, And we're walking there? Like like there's because it's like this suburban and rural mindset is like all around, geared around the car, which is very kind of isolated and stuff like that. And you leave your house, you get in your car, and then you drive to from
Mm,
point A to point B, and you're not actually like in your community because you're going through a metal tube, or sitting in
yeah.
this box and like going from point A to point B. And before we keep on going, are you familiar with the idea of the 15-minute city?
No, I've never heard of that.
All right, this is the new boogeyman on like Fox News and Newsmax and all these right-wing things, and it kind of comes into your to what you're talking about is like it's this idea of that you should be able to leave your house and everything that you could possibly need is within a 15-minute walk. So
Okay,
like your
yeah.
grocery store, like this is basically what I'm in a 15-minute city right now. So like
Yeah,
I walk
yeah.
outside my door, there are multiple bars, there are like four or five grocery stores, there like anything that I could possibly need is within a 15-minute walk. And so public policymakers, progressive ones, are kind of geared around like let's get more people, let's try to redesign cities and towns and stuff like that around this like 15-minute city concept. And like for some reason the right has completely latched onto this as like the second coming of Satan, that these liberals want us to live in. They want you to not be able to drive in your car, or all this kind of stuff. anyway, that it's
That
funny
is,
because I'm
it's
surprised you haven't heard of
fascinating.
that because
No,
it
like
does tie it.
yeah, it's fascinating and not at all surprising that they would have that reaction to it. And I would have included it in my notes here had I known about us. Don't let me forget it because we'll come back to that too.
Yeah.
Um, is that yeah, so yeah, but you leave your house, you get in your car. If you want to go to the bar, you go to Buffalo Wild Wings and it's like 10 miles away and it's in a strip and you go to Haircut and you go to Great Clips, right? And there's none of these sort of like level community building places. So it, at the time when I think people were coming up with the idea, it was yeah, this sort of idea of these like quiet oases, right? And without the hustle and bustle of the city. And what they didn't understand was the importance of these community building third places and of the ability to walk around your neighborhood and know your neighbors and socialize in that way. Because, currently, um, we are in the midst of what public health officials are calling the loneliness epidemic. Since the early 70s, which was when sociologists started to track self-reported rates of loneliness and problems of mental health with loneliness, we are the loneliest that we've ever been, and probably, in fact, are the loneliest that we've ever been. In 1970, it was estimated that about 11% of Americans were suffering from problems related to social exclusion and loneliness. Now those numbers are estimated to be about 60,
Mhm.
right?
Because we've moved
Which
because of white flight and moving out of the cities and moving into the suburbs,
which is a
basically.
yeah, I mean, it's a huge contributing factor. And um they're calling it a public health crisis because so I looked up I found this great journal article, Holt Lundstad et al. 2019, if anyone listening is to look it up, a meta-analysis of the literature looking at exclusion, loneliness, and long-term health outcomes. So meta-analysis is one of those journal articles where they look through as many articles as they can find and then summarize the results, right? So it's like an
Mhm.
article about the science. And they found that the influence of social isolation on mortality is about as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Mm. That
So
sounds like one of
being,
those exaggerated things, like how sitting is the new smoking cigarettes. But
yeah, no, being lonely will kill you as quickly as 15 cigarettes a day. And there have been a few studies that have found this, that sort of all these markers of mortality and early death and heart disease and just when you look at them in correlation to social isolation, it's just like it's 1-to-1 every single time. This book called CQ by Rachel Radke, which is actually it's a graphic memoir, talks about that a lot too, about sort of like this realization in the 80s about how bad loneliness is for you. It is terrible for it kills you. Um, and part of it may have to do with the fact that being socially isolated and lonely releases the same kind of stress hormones as actual physical threats,
Mhm.
right? And this is one of the surprising things that people found, um, was that it turns out that, and it makes sense if you look at sort of our reactions to things from like an evolutionary perspective, right? So if you're a hunter-gatherer society, which is how we lived for the first, 290,000 years of anatomically modern humans before the agricultural revolution. If you're kicked out of your band, you're fucked,
yeah.
right? You can't do it on your own. Like there's that whole show Survivor Man about a guy just trying to do it for a week. And he's like a survival expert and he teaches it. And at the end of every single week, he hasn't slept and he's dehydrated and he's starving, right? Like you
Mhm.
cannot do it alone. So we evolved a response to being socially excluded, which we perceive it as a physical threat. Our our brains react pretty much the same way to being picked last for wiffle ball in seventh grade as they do to a bear that wants to eat us,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, and the theory now is that we react like this is it's designed to make us behave in ways that keep us included in a group, right? Included in a community, right? Because you have to be in order to survive. That the people who have that stronger response to being included in a community were the people who were less likely to be kicked out, and therefore the most likely to pass on their genes, more likely to survive.
I have a
Uh,
question for you.
yeah.
Is it just me? Like, I don't what so you've probably noticed a lot of articles that are written today about why it's so hard to find new friends when you're in your 30s or 40s.
Mhm.
You've noticed these articles, right?
I mean,
I don't remember.
I've lived it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But
Yeah.
like, I don't remember those. Maybe I wasn't looking for them because I was in my 20s or whatever, but I don't remember those articles being published in our 20s. Do you think this is like a somewhat new phenomena, the idea of it getting really hard? Maybe not completely new, but that it's getting worse, so that it's getting harder for us to make
Well,
friends as we get older.
yeah. Well, at the same time that we're the lonelier than we've ever been, we're also oddly, and perhaps not oddly, more connected to more people than any generation in history. It's hard to overemphasize how weird that is.
Yeah,
That you and I are still friends 99% of it through the internet, even though because we worked at the same warehouse 20 years ago
yeah,
for 2.5 months, right? But we are in contact with more people than any generation in history, right?
yeah.
Um, simply because of social media. And that's actually a problem that they're talking about a lot here in, well, not here, but in academia, is that because we're talking about sort of retention. And one of the problems with retention, it turns out that the academics of your university do not matter. How good your school is doesn't matter. The thing that retains students is do those students believe that this is their new home?
Mm.
You can actually predict to within a couple percentage points the retention rate of a school by sitting outside and counting the number of people who wear like branded school gear,
Wow.
who feel that they're part of the community. Once they cease to see it as a place that it's a place to mechanically advance their degrees, once they see it as their second home, then they'll retain. But now, so that's why, like universities used to have like events and everyone in the dorm comes down and paints their faces and yells and shit, right? But like
That's
people,
why they officially like cooperated with the fraternities and the sororities,
yeah,
probably.
yeah. But like people don't make new friends in college now because they
Really
bring their high school friends with them.
interesting. Okay.
So here's a mind fuck of a number. So the average internet user, of which we are, spends between 2.5 and 5 hours a day on social media. Guess guess how many hours we on average spend per year socializing in person?
40.
Between one day and 5 days. 5 days is extreme upper end, but average is between 24 and 48 total hours of socialization with other people spent per year who are not like our significant others. Yeah. So
That
40 is
seems
right about
that's
there.
that seems low, but I guess okay. Like so if you hang out with like one friend every Friday for 2 hours,
Mhm.
you'd be a way above average at that point.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
And I'm probably right about there, right? So like
Yeah.
Carmen and I have friends here in South Bend, but we usually hang out with them about once a month
Yeah.
for like an
And
evening
that's what
for a few
sucks.
hours.
Like
Yeah.
so not to make this too personal, but this is what makes this hopefully makes this podcast so great is that we can tie it into the personal is like, I still have I live in DC. It's very, itinerant transient city. I've felt a lot of stress over the fact that a lot of my friends moved away. But
Hmm.
when I think about it, I still have like a decent number of friends here, but I no longer have the friend. I don't have a single friend. I have one friend left who fits in this category. The casual, hey, what are you doing tonight? Kind of
Hmm.
friend.
Yeah.
Not whereas like every other
Not the
friend that I had,
schedule friend, but the could just hang out friend.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And he moved to another part of the city, so it's even
Hmm.
harder. Like it was easier when he was like a few blocks away. I have lost all those casual, let's
Hmm.
go get a drink today, or let's go, let's just get together tonight
Well,
kind of things. And everything is very scheduled.
so it turns out that what you need to make a new friend is a certain number of hours of contact, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that is to make a friend that crosses over from that cordial to let's schedule hangouts to I can share things with you and confide in you.
Yeah.
And you need a lot of them,
Yeah.
right?
And
So,
that's why a lot of your friends come from either college or work because you're like at
yeah,
work, you're with them 8 hours a day. So you have enough of that contact
yeah,
to have those put in those reps so that
yeah.
you can develop that sort of relationship.
I mean, why did we become friends, Simon? We were
Yeah.
working at a fireworks warehouse, pulling in like what, 90, 100 hour weeks, and it
Yeah.
was boring as hell. So, what did we do all day? We just bullshitted.
Yeah.
Like, I had never met you before. And then within a week, we're hanging out 16 hours a day and just talking,
Yeah.
right?
We were like best friends within like 2 weeks.
Yeah. So, like, we speed run it, right? You
Yeah.
know? And the last time I made a new friend like that. Now, yeah, like, so we have some friends here in Omaha, and like they're getting better and closer, but it's taken a long time. It's taken like we've been friends with our friends Karen Drew for like 3 years now, but it's like it was like every other month, like scheduling a
Yeah.
hangout, and it's getting better, but it's taken a long time. The last time I speed ran a new one was my a buddy I made, and like we're still friends, but it's when I was in rehab, right?
Yeah.
Which,
Okay.
like,
Yeah.
what do you do
Yeah.
when you're in rehab? Like, you
Yeah.
sit around and you smoke cigarettes and you talk and you're like emotionally raw and you got all the time in the world, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
The last time I made like an actual genuine friend was like because I've been self-employed since 2014, so I have not had that experience of being around someone like all the time, enough to make the friend. And the last time I like made what I would consider a genuine new friend, it was probably like 2015 or something like
mhm,
that,
yeah.
which was years ago. And just to tell you another anecdote, like I was at a birthday. My wife is fortunately much more social than I am, and she has a job that where people don't move away from DC, so she has like a lot more close friends. We were at the birthday party of her friend's husband at a bar, and we met this guy. And it turned out, I struck up a conversation with him. He was, really fun to talk to, and he lives like literally on the same corner as me. So
Mhm.
immediately I was like, this is going to sound really weird, but can I have your phone number? And he's like, sure. I was like, it's like I actually, I want to make new friends. I want to make new guy friends. And so yeah, so that I was very upfront with him that I was trying to make a new friend, and he seemed to be game. So he gave me his phone number, and then we had like a New Year's party like several weeks later. And so I invited him to the New Year's party. He came. He seemed to have a great time. He chatted up with all of our mutual friends and yada yada yada. And then he left for that night, and that was January 1st. It's now we're all the way through February. Neither of us has
Mhm.
texted each other since.
Yeah,
And every single week when Mira and I or something, it's like I should text Austin and see what he's doing, but I just can't bring myself to do it because there isn't like it's like what you said, you have to spend a certain number of hours with someone in
yeah,
order to feel natural to like pull them into your kind of social circle.
exactly. And so yeah, when we had more of these third places that were just places that you just went to go be, that happened a lot, I think, more quickly, and it happened in like a community building function, whether it's like the neighborhood barbershop or the neighborhood bar, like all these places or civic organizations. One of the things that like Oldenburg talks about too is like the decline in like rotaries, school boards. Like the PTA was like a huge thing in
Yeah.
the 60s and 70s, and like nobody's a member of like a PTA now.
Yeah. And
I don't even
church attendance is now down.
church attendance, right? And so all but like all these things have declined. And um which yeah, it means that like the likelihood of being able to get these number of hours of contact is just it is so small now that it just doesn't happen. And so which takes me back to so the research about this sort of like threat response to loneliness that was really surprising to researchers was only in 2014 that was published, and it was, I don't know how to pronounce the person's last name. Again, if you're listening, you want to look it up. I think it's Cacioppo, Cacioppo, 2014, University of Chicago. Found that loneliness triggers a threat response, right? But then something interesting happens beyond that. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you'll probably have a single group in mind when I finish explaining this research. Because the socially isolated person begins to perceive other people as a threat because they are the ones who are causing the social isolation, they begin to self-isolate further. They perceive more and more people as a threat. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And they start to become intentionally self-isolated, which then only serves to reinforce that self-isolation, right? So it gets worse, right? The one that came to my mind was the incel culture, right? Which was this culture of people who had found each other, and all of their ethos online, like when I was explaining it to you after having like randomly discovered the subreddit, this was like a couple years before like it blew up, and it was about, yeah, look, these people have a self-fulfilling philosophy. They're designed to make them stay lonely, right?
Yeah. So
It,
incels, I'm sure a lot of it's come into the mainstream now, so most people know what it is, but
yeah,
it's men that believe for some reason, either for physical reasons or just social, like their own personality reasons, they are undesirable to women, basically.
yeah. And then they started this community. It was on 4chan and then also Reddit. That subreddit's now banned, in which they were sort of basically reinforcing each other's decisions to withdraw from society, to hate women, to basically be as isolated as possible and only find community in each other. And so that's the interesting thing. So what happens when the socially isolated person who has already developed a threat response to just people, because people are the people who are causing these feelings of isolation. When the socially isolated person who has already developed a threat response to people, what happens when they find a group online that offers them a sense of community and inclusion
Mhm.
at the small price of turning that threat response against a particular group of people? Then you get online political radicalization. I don't think it's any coincidence that we are the loneliest that we've ever been. We are the most connected that we've ever been. And at the same time, we get this massive increase in conspiracy theories and online political radicalizations and QAnon. And these, if you're lonely and you're reaching out for some sort of human connection, and the internet can do that, the internet can give you that sense of connection. I mean, we're doing it right now. If you're offered inclusion from a group of people and they were like, yes, I know why you're feeling socially isolated, I know why you're feeling lonely, it's their fault, but we're your friends.
Yeah. And not surprisingly, obviously, QAnon aligns with Trumpism, which is largely, where is his strength? It's in the rural, the
Mhm.
outside the cities. It's in the rural areas where people are more isolated.
Yeah. And so there's a bunch of research going on right now that is looking at this fact that people who are lonely and socially isolated are particularly vulnerable to online radicalization. It could be religious, it could be political, it could be these sort of like really toxic social groups like incels, it could be conspiracy theories like QAnon, you know? QAnon was so powerful, I think, because it was so gregarious. It took all comers, right? I mean, so you
Mhm.
get, for example, like this weird overlap between QAnon and like women's groups on Facebook, right? Which are talking about vaccines and stuff. Well, research has shown that it is much harder often for women to convince doctors to prescribe them medications or to listen to them
Mhm.
than it is to men.
Yeah.
Like the numbers just support that. The average number of like the average amount of time it can take a woman to convince a new doctor to prescribe or diagnose is just longer for men, right? So if you've got this group of people online who have gotten together and they are searching for somebody who will just listen to them, right? They are suddenly vulnerable to like anti-vaccine conspiracy theory groups, which flourished on Facebook, which had a dovetail with QAnon because QAnon again took all comers, right? And so this is why it is actually, or probably, so I'm a librarian. And in 2016, we started with a lot of um, public education sort of uh, efforts because we were going to fight fake news, right?
Mhm.
And we can fight it. We can fight
When you
fake
say
news and
we,
conspiracy theories
like college professors were getting
to college
together.
professors and mostly librarians, right? And we're
Yeah.
going to do it through public education. Knowledge is power. And the more you know, and we failed. We failed miserably. We had no chance. We had no chance. I was given workshops. We were all given workshops. We were sharing best practices. We failed. Absolutely fucking failed. We had no chance. Because it turns out, and this is where this all loops around eventually back to the Manson family, is that it is impossible to argue someone out of a conspiracy theory. Because what they're protecting is not the belief itself. They're protecting the community that they found.
Yeah.
If the conspiracy is proven false, there is no reason for the conspiracy theory to exist. There's no reason for the community to exist. All of a sudden, they're alone again.
Mm. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. So you're trying to use sort of logic and well-reasoned arguments. They perceive it as you're attacking their only source of community, right? It's
Yeah.
impossible to just argue someone out of a conspiracy theory. And
Well, it's this idea of, I mean, you hear this word tribalism, and that's
yeah,
what, it's like you're part of a tribe, and you don't want to betray the tribe.
yeah. And so the thing that was so attractive about the Manson family to people wasn't the persuasive philosophy of this illiterate felon. It was the fact that Charles Manson was very good. Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, the late 1960s. There's a lot of sort of lost, uprooted young people who were just moving around. They are traveling there to try to find something. They're lonely anyway.
Hmm.
Um, Trisha Krenwinkel said that she became his follower because he was the first person to ever tell her that she was beautiful.
Hmm.
He preyed on people who were lonely, who were obviously looking for something. What was so attractive was not his philosophy, it was the fact that he had a family and he invited them into it and they were made to feel a part of it. And within sometimes as little as a year, were willing to kill for it. Right. And so this is the real danger, I think, to our society of this loneliness epidemic is that if we don't create places for people to alleviate this, I mean, there are organizations on the internet who have time and passion and money and labor power who are completely happy to accept people at the small price of adherence to a political ideology. And so it's no surprise that the 15-minute community has become a conservative boogeyman because Fox News has a vested interest, for example, in fear-based programming. It's been proven that uh, making people afraid makes them more conservative. I remember one study I read a while ago where talking to people about the dangers of not getting a flu vaccine and how sick it can make you suddenly made them much more conservative on immigration issues.
Wow.
Being afraid makes you more conservative.
Hmm.
Being lonely and isolated makes it easier to make you afraid, makes it easier to radicalize you politically and to
Yeah.
become part of these kind of cult-like movements. And then you can't be dissuaded from them. You can't convince a QAnon person to not be a QAnon person by arguing with them
Yeah.
because what they perceive that you're trying to do now is you're trying to destroy their community, the only kind of sense of community that they have. So
So
when
the
we're talking about, yeah, like the loneliness epidemic and the loss of third places and how hard it is, even like for us to make new friends, we're actually also talking about sort of like there is a danger here to the things that make society work, that make democracy work, right? Because this sort of trend towards factionalism and political radicalization and tribalism, right, are they threaten sort of a functional, healthy society.
so the idea of this 15-minute city, obviously, in order to make it work, there needs to be a lot of mixed use zoning. that allows
Mhm.
for a lot of different, like, in the building I'm in right now, I'm in an apartment building. There is a bar downstairs. There was a pizza parlor.
Yeah.
There was like a Wawa. I walk across the street. There's a gym. There's a Target. There's a grocery store. Like there's a lot of different kinds of businesses and
Mhm.
residential, like in a very small piece of town or small geographic area. And you kind of honed in on zoning as kind of a boogeyman that caused this. So is that the answer? Is like we need better zoning laws or less zoning restrictions in order to allow for these third places to start to sprout up again?
I think partially, yeah. Although we do also just kind of live in the age of social media now too. So I think part of it is to rebuild communities that have this sort of organic capacity for in-person social interaction. But then part of it too is to, we should really look at like ways to construct virtual third places, I guess, that meet that socialization function, um, but that aren't given to this sort of like propensity for like online political radicalization. And there's a bunch of research that it has looked at that too, and it social media can function as a perfectly healthy third place. There's certain things that need to be in place for that to happen. Um, they found that Pittman wrote a few articles about it as well as a dissertation I saw, found that communities where people feel, well, one, communities of interest, so subreddits, but healthy ones, places where people feel that like their contributions are valued, that they're not just using social media to just watch other people. Like, so that's why doom scrolling on Instagram or Facebook can make people so much more depressed, because people tend to only post happy things on their status updates, and so it's
Yeah.
just going to make you feel fucking miserable if
Well,
you're
it's not
just
just
sort of.
that. Like the doom scrolling that I know of is like, and I've kind of like become a lot happier in the last year because I was like, I need to stop getting stressed out about shit I can't change, which
Mhm.
is like whatever the Republicans are doing now, whatever Trump's doing, the latest poll saying Biden might lose in November. Like, stop. There's nothing I can do to change that right now. And so, like,
Yeah.
I kind of, when I moved over from Twitter to Threads, is I made
I
sure
made
not
sure
to
not to.
I made sure not to follow all those like political pundits that I followed before. I've stopped listening to politics podcasts. I've really like lessened the amount of like bad doom scrolling type news
Yeah,
that
yeah,
comes through my feed, and I feel like I've been more optimistic and more carefree when I'm not getting angry all the time. I'm not like getting agitated over
yeah,
stuff I can't change. So I think that's also part
totally.
of it is like is I now I like witness these people and they're just like getting in fights all day. They're writing these posts of despair about how terrible the world is now and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And I feel like I notice it now more than ever that I've kind of like removed myself from that conversation and have made a point of like posting very little political content these days. Like I used to like tweet all day about politics and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And now that I've made this conscious decision to stop like consuming or sharing much political news, and I know that we're getting somewhat off topic here, like I've felt a lot happier and a lot more at peace as a result. Like I'm not worried
Yeah,
about November.
yeah. And which also means that probably, because you'd be engaging in sort of these like really stressful topics online, if you're sort of engaging more in communities of interest, that can again kind of it can function as a perfectly suitable kind of third place analog in a digital space. Is if you're meeting with people because of like an organic shared interest, and you're actually kind of like having these organic unstructured conversations where you're sharing and you're interacting, but also at the same time in a moderated space. Like Reddit has become in many ways healthier, um once like those subreddits, like the incel subreddit, got shut down, um because you need, it turns out, some kind of a moderation that is going to you know keep trolls keep very toxic people out, right? But not so heavy-handed as to make people think that their interactions are being um, policed, I guess, right? To allow for sort of organic but positive spaces, and that's a very fine line to balance. And so maybe back to your idea then about resurrecting um, you know, physical third spaces, 15-minute communities, rebuilding them, maybe allowing people more of these in-person options for this kind of socialization uh, will mean that people just spend less time doom scrolling, will
Yeah.
spend less time online because they don't need to try. Sorry, my alarm's going off. Um, but yeah, because I mean, I think there's this association between like, oh, social media makes you lonelier, and like, I think that there's not necessarily a causation there. I think it's just that people are lonelier and they have fewer options for like in-person socialization and fewer options to make friends. And so what do? They go to social media. Because what
Yeah.
else are you gonna do? Like you're looking for some kind of connection, right? So whereas and yeah, not to get off on like a tangent where it's apparently possible to build these like third places online. I think it's so much harder and requires sort of more provision and labor in terms of moderation, as opposed to like organic in-person third places that yeah, I think at the very least, trying to return as much as possible to this sort of like idea of having these kind of local community building spaces and interactions with people. Yeah, it's just gonna hopefully would make people less likely to spend time online, make people less lonely. If they're less lonely and spending less time online, they're less likely to become politically radicalized.
So you hear this thing that like there's no major political party in the rest of the developed world like the Republican Party. Like
Hmm.
there are conservatives in other countries, but at least they can agree that climate change exists and is an important issue, and at least they can agree that universal health care is something we should all strive for.
Yeah.
It's only the Republican Party that has a stranglehold over a major developed nation's government and believes all these incredibly, radical things. So like what is unique about the US, and this is kind of just me spitballing based on what you're saying, is like one, we're more spread out than most other countries. Like
Yeah.
most other countries
Hugely.
are just denser. You look
Hmm.
at these small countries in Europe and stuff like that. Like people just live closer together. And then like you look at US, it's just like a wasteland. Like it's just like, you have like these very concentrated cities, but everything else is just like all spread out. And then like one thing that I've heard is we fetishize home ownership over way more than other countries do.
Hmm.
And so what do you do in order to be able to afford a home? You have to move away from the cities where the
Yeah.
cost of living is cheaper. And so that's why, one thing I always lament living in a city is that like, your friends will always have kids. And what do they do as soon as they have kids? They move to the suburbs.
Hmm.
And so I wonder if the idea of like, because we have such a vast land, and allowing the population to spread out, and we fetishize home ownership, which gives us even more incentive to leave the more expensive cities, that has caused us to become less connected as a culture, and that's why
Yeah.
we have this crazy political party
Well,
that succeeds in the rural areas.
it's funny because what you're basically describing is also the idea of, have you ever heard of American exceptionalism?
Yeah, I mean that we are truly the best country in the world,
No,
and
not exceptional in terms of how good we are, but the original idea of American exceptionalism as in terms of an exception to a rule.
okay.
Exceptionalism was articulated by Thomas Jefferson was a big proponent of it. It was this
Mhm.
idea that the United States, if we conveniently forget all the people who already live here when the white people came, is this sort of land that is open to development. And because it is free of the inherited structures of aristocracy and royalty,
Mhm.
that it would be free from that conflict, right? So in Jefferson's idealized view of American exceptionalism, you would have a family that works a tiny little farm, and then they raise some babies, and then those babies move 4 miles west, and then they have a tiny little farm, and then they move 4 miles west, and they have a tiny little farm, and then that just goes on forever, and it would take hundreds of generations to reach the Pacific Ocean, right? Um, and eventually, of course, we ran out of country. We hit the ocean, and then we had a train, and so like the American West was no longer this endless sort of thing to move into. So we just merely transposed the idea of the freedom of the American West into the freedom of the open road.
Okay.
You can just drive somewhere and be free, right? But I think there's a reason why like the freedom of the open road and then like the cowboy. How many shows the cowboy he rides into town and he solves a problem and a woman falls in love with him, but he's got somewhere else to be off in the sunset. So by the end of the episode, he gets back on his horse and he doesn't have a home, doesn't have attachments. He's an individual, right?
Mhm.
This idea of like not just fetishizing homeownership, but like the romanticizing of the individual, the lone,
Yeah.
steely-eyed cowboy staring off into the sunset, right?
Yeah.
Of being alone as somehow a thing that is laudable, that's something that you should pursue, right? And so yeah, I think that coupled, you're right, with like, oh my God, I did not realize how big the US was until I had to drive it. To like I
Yeah.
drove from like Oregon. I was like 20, I was in my late 20s. I drove from Oregon all the way to Chicago. There's so much of it.
And there's
Like
vast
I had
like
flown
spaces
over
of
it.
nothing
Yeah,
too.
right. I mean, even in Nebraska, like I'm in far eastern Nebraska, and when we moved here, Carmen really wanted to go to Carhenge, right?
Hmm.
Which is that like art installation of cars like a car. 8 hours, 8 hours on the interstate
Yeah.
to get to Carhenge. It is so far away, but yeah, like being so spread out, and then in comparison to like the UK, for example, which is like much smaller. And then, I mean, it's just kind of like town and town and town and town. And then even cities are like more compact. And you still, I think, have much more common, like, well, it's no coincidence, I think, that like, people in urban areas tend to be less likely to vote Republican, right? Because
Hmm.
you're in more contact with more people and a greater diversity of people.
Yeah.
So you're going to be less terrified of the other,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, I think you're right. I think it's kind of like this, yeah, size and also this sort of like fetishization of like being alone and sort of like having your own little tiny country unto yourself somewhere off.
And it
Uh,
also goes back to the isolation of the car that we were talking about. Because like
yeah,
in
yeah,
Europe and most other developed countries, like they have much more robust public transportation.
yeah, and just
And
more compact cities, so you can just walk to a place.
yeah.
And
I
I mean, I
mean,
recall, yeah,
Americans spend so much time alone every single
mhm,
day. I mean, I don't know the statistics, but think of how many collective millions of hours we spend alone in a car every single day.
yeah, and even when you're in a city, like how often an apartment building is just an apartment building, as opposed to have like an apartment building where the first floor is all shops, it's all things to do, it's all these kind of spaces where people can go, and even that is something that you don't often see a lot. You just get sort of like this is where you live and this is where you shop, and never the twain shall meet.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you have something there.
So yeah, but that's how we get from the decline in neighborhood bars after your prohibition talk to the Manson family to QAnon.
So Prohibition started a downfall. There's a direct line between Prohibition and QAnon.
There's a direct line between prohibition and the loss of a vital third space. I mean, yeah, because if you go back to this idea that the average neighborhood bar drew 80% of its business from within a 2 block radius, two
Yeah.
blocks,
Hmm.
which means that every like 2 to 4 blocks there was another one, right?
Yeah.
And you're down from 215,000 in 1897 to 67,000. Well, sorry, 215,000 plus an additional 50,000 unlicensed saloon to less than 70,000 now.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's these shock waves that you still see going on, right? Of course, that's not the entirety of it, but I think it's a huge part of it. I mean, that was a major third place that we lost.
Yeah. I buy it.
Yeah.
All right, man. This is Another great episode. We now have three of these in the bag.
Yeah.
I don't I don't know why I have it in my head, but I want to make it to 50 episodes.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not saying we have to stop then, but I would love to like have 50 episodes that we've recorded.
I mean, I would like to have 52 because that would be like a year's worth if we're doing this every week.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there might be weeks that like we have the flu or something like that, and then we
Oh
can't
yeah.
do a week. But like, it would
Oh,
be nice to have
oh
a full
no.
year's
Yeah.
worth. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there definitely gonna be weeks where one or both of us is traveling or just something is happening. It's like, sorry, I'm going to a barbecue or something like that. But
Yeah.
as long as we try to follow up and at least, not because I think like what happens is you skip 1 week and then it just starts kind of the next time you skip 2 weeks and then it just starts
Yeah.
trailing off and then you just
Yeah.
stop doing
You go to a barbecue, you meet a new friend, and then you're like, I'm going to hang out with you once over the next year.
it. And then I'll
We're,
email you again and we'll put it on our
we're going to
Google
schedule
Calendar.
it weeks out. And then at the last minute, someone's going to cancel. Then, yeah, I'm just going to stay home and doom scroll on Reddit.
Yeah. All
All
right,
right, man.
cool.
So what do you got for me next week? Do you have any
So
ideas?
you have a bunch of ideas. So like my friend Jen, we have one listener. Her name's Jen. She
Is
had
that the gym?
heard, yeah, you met her.
Okay, yeah.
She apparently listened to an episode and texted me, and she put in a vote that she was really a few weeks ago. I floated a few ideas. I have a Google Doc now, and now every time I think of something that would be good for like one of these episodes, I stop what I'm doing. I open the Google Doc, and it's called just discussions with Craig or something like that, and
Okay, yeah.
I throw it in there. But one of my original ideas was talking about HBO and basically, you think of like modern day Netflix and how all the major movie studios hate Netflix. That was
Hmm.
originally HBO. Like all like the basically all the Hollywood studios got together and tried to destroy HBO, and they were
Yeah.
barely kind of thwarted in those efforts. And I think HBO also has just like a really interesting origin story because it's so much different today than what it was when it originally
Yeah.
started.
It's funny because that was also so Carmen had overheard you talking about HBO and she brought up she's like, "You know what? Like I never thought of it before, but like HBO, I remember being a kid, it was like racy and
Oh yeah.
adult, but it was kind of trashy, right? It was
Yes.
not like refined high-end epic television. We are
Yeah.
HBO, Game of Thrones, right? We make art.
Yeah.
It was
And if
like yeah.
and
So
if
like
you
what happened?
well, I don't want to go too far into it, and I don't want to
Yeah.
give
Well,
too many
yeah, I
things.
don't tell
But
me and I'm not
like,
going to read about it
but
either, but
if you look at like a lot of like the HBO shows when HBO started ramping up and started making its own TV shows, like if you look at like The Sopranos and stuff like that, you'll notice there's like copious amounts of nudity in it.
mhm,
And it was what the executives at HBO called cable edge. It was their code word for it. And
mhm,
anytime there was a script that came in for a new episode that didn't have any nudity in it, they would send back notes that it needed more cable edge because
yeah.
there was this perception that like the people who watched HBO were men. And so
Mhm.
if you look at like a lot of the early programming, it was like one of their most popular shows, and I'm probably giving too much away now. This is probably something we should say for next week, but like one of their most popular shows, do you remember it like took place in a legal brothel?
No, I don't remember that at all.
Okay, okay. Well, we'll talk about all this next week.
Okay. And I'm not going to read anything about HBO, but
Yeah,
yes, I am. I'm looking forward to learning more about it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, man.
They had a
Well,
show set in a brothel, really?
yeah, it was called like something bunnies or something like that. It was like in a Nevada brothel where it
Oh,
was like
really? Huh.
legal. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. All right, man.
Okay.
Well, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording. And
All right,
this
buddy.
was thanks for teaching me about third places.
Yeah.